Every day, your City of Tempe staff goes above and beyond to make sure our community gets the best possible services and the most for our tax dollars. But how good is good? How do you measure it? And how do we know what we really need to make progress on some of our most pressing issues? To guide us, we developed a series of goals designed to help us improve our community based on our Tempe City Council's 5 strategic priorities. Reaching for excellence, we are comparing ourselves against the rest of the nation as well as ourselves. Some of our goals will help save lives. Some of them will help us save money. All of them will help us make Tempe a better place. Tempe Accelerates is an opportunity for you to get involved. Hear what city staff and community partners are doing to reach our goals. Your role? You are a vital part of our community. Share your ideas and help us craft better solutions. Ask questions. Be part of the conversation either in person or online. Check tempe.gov/Tempe Accelerates for dates and times of our next programs and collaborate with us at Tempe City Hall. Today, we will hyper-focus on 2 performance measures. Each presenting team will have 10 minutes to share data, strategies, and progress on a performance measure. Then, you will have about 10 minutes to ask questions or offer suggestions and ideas. On the back of your agenda, we have resource questions to help you participate in the conversation. Also included with your agenda is a quick survey with space you can use to include any ideas or suggestions you might have about today's topics. Thank you for participating. Now, let's accelerate.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome back to Tempe Accelerates. We have 2 presentations, as the video says. Today we're going to be focusing in on the theme of safety. First, performance measure 1.23, safety in parks, and then performance measure 1.11, safety in city facilities. So we will have the presentations, and after each presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. If you have questions but you don't get a chance to ask them, or comments or feedback, please utilize the feedback forms that are in the back of the chambers if you haven't already gotten one. So without any further ado, we will welcome up the first presenters for Safety in Parks.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Horn. I'm the Northside Patrol Commander here at the Tempe Police Department, and this is?
And I'm Brooks Luton with Police Analytics, the Spark Supervisor.
Brooks is by far away the smartest person, at least at this table, for sure. So if the questions get a little bit too difficult, I'll just do something like that. So we're here to talk about feeling of safety in parks, and the specific council priority that looks at or is under is safe and secure communities. The performance measure, and I'm not going to read this verbatim, but you can see that there it's achieving a rating of very satisfied or satisfied as far as feeling of safety in the parks. And the goal is to get to the point that we are above 10% for all benchmark cities with this particular measure. So why does this measure matter? First of all, when you look at the not feeling safe in parks, it reduces park use, and you say, duh, that makes sense. But when you think about it, it's much deeper than that, because parks are those places where we've essentially, as a city, as a larger community, have said this is where we're going to do community. This is where we're going to engage with one another, meet each other, have our kids meet each other, play with the animals, our dogs, and that sort of thing. So this is that space where we actually do community, as far as for the most part, as far as a city comes together. And so that has an impact on the feeling of community when the use of those parks is reduced for whatever reason. And further, when you're looking at safety and the lowering of the feeling of safety in parks, it just reduces trust in city services, far beyond even just the police department. Is when people go to that space and it either doesn't look clean and it just doesn't, for whatever reason, I just don't feel safe there, the lights don't work, whatever it comes into being to make you feel less safe in that area that's there, it just reduces, quite frankly, for city employees, for me, for our teams, for everybody that works together on these, it's just a credibility thing for our community when they look at that. And then looking at why this measure matters, it's just that measure of community sentiment, and it ensures that communication between community and police. in our world as a police department, oftentimes we get laser focused on data points, on crime rates and stats, and there's a lot that goes into it because we put high value on the safety of our community. What this particular measure helps us with goes deeper than just the actual numbers of safety and crime, but it goes into how do you feel in those areas. So those areas that we're working on to address crime, how do you actually feel about that? Because that's critically important. It's kind of where the people matches up with the data that we're looking at. And then lastly, it really helps us inform effective strategy to address that feeling of safety. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies that we're looking at here. And with that, then it makes sure that we're bringing all the right players to the table to help with this particular measure.
Our first indicator of where we are with this is performance measures, the output from the community survey, which takes 6 measures of feelings of safety in parks. We look at neighborhoods, city, and desert parks, both during the day and at night. And what you can see from these results is that they vary widely. So in city parks during the daytime, we have over 80% of respondents said that they were satisfied or very satisfied with their feelings of safety. At the other end, at night and desert parks, only 36% of respondents answered that way.
So when you look at these, we look at those numbers, sometimes it's difficult. So what does that actually mean? So what does it mean when people don't feel safe in a particular space? It can mean something different for each one of those types of locations. So where are we at right now? We have right now existing 2 parks officers that are primarily, when they were put together over the last couple years, primarily their focus was on our desert parks, a lot of the encampments and that sort of thing up in the north part of our city. They have since, just because of necessity, been spread out through multiple city parks, a lot of our city parks throughout the city. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. We've got the 3-year homeless operations plan as a city, which is right now coming into the beginning of the 3rd year of that, and that comes into funding for our friends over in Public Works as far as cleaning up encampments, and some staffing assistance for human services as they reach out to folks. And so while this particular measure is not homeless specific, there clearly is integration. When you go and talk to our community about the issues that they're seeing in the parks and the concerns that they have, there is clear integration with those issues and other council priorities as well. We're also doing research on curfew throughout the valley, specifically in our parks. What we have found is, so far, that we are the only city in the valley that has a civil park curfew. Every other city is criminal. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's some history to that in our city and kind of what we're doing to look at that, perhaps changing that right now. We're also researching tools for enhanced community feedback. The survey, as you know, or I think you know, happens every single year. In fact, right now, the surveys are out being looked at. So that's a good thing. The challenge, though, is as you look at different strategies to impact specifically this, you want to have a good idea as quick as you can. Are you truly making an impact? Because if you're going to invest in some of these solutions, it just makes sense that we would be able to evaluate that as quick as we can to see if we're making an impact. Are we turning a corner, or is it having no impact and we need to divert? And we want to know that prior to the next survey. And so we're researching some methods to do that. And then just generally learning from our successes and failures over the years. And our friends with community services and Public Works, if you take a look at Escalante over the years, and those of you that have been connected to the city for some time, I think would acknowledge that was not an area in the past that people enjoyed going to. However, over time, because of a lot of the collaboration that took place, a lot of the measures, including private security, some of the maintenance that happened out there, design and redesign, the park activation, a lot of those things that happened out there over time has had a positive impact in the community, the feeling of safety, and just if you talk to our employees, the ones I've talked to have said that's had an impact. And so that's a success that's important for us to look at. So what is our target? So our target is 88% across all park types and time of day, and this is highly aspirational for us. Because really the measure calls for an overall. So we could be really good in a certain area, not as good in another area, and come up with an overall and hit that mark. and we could go home and feel good about ourselves. But the reality is, as a police department, is we prefer that every space where we have designed as a city for us to do community, that every one of those locations are at that high level of service. Doesn't matter if it's the day and the night. Highly aspirational. It's a big number to shoot for, but that's something that's important to us. As far as annual increases, we're going to talk about private security as a strategy here in just a little bit. But we're looking at some increases, 1% or so in those parks without private security, and then 5% in those with private security. We'll talk about that. Those are, to be honest, a little bit arbitrary on the numbers, but ultimately what we believe will happen is in a beta test that we're looking at over the next 6 months to a year, we believe that we'll see significant increases in the feeling of safety in those parks compared to some of the other parks where we're doing some other measures, but not the full rollout, if you will, with that.
So there are more than 40 parks in Tempe. We're really fortunate. We have more than 1 park per square mile. That's a lot of parks. So when we think about feelings of safety, one of the things that we need to think about is what amount of calls for service and crime are the police currently handling in those upwards of 40 parks. If the bulk of our crime and calls for service is occurring in parks, then that's something we need to address immediately in order to help people feel safer. So to that end, we examine both calls for service and crime in parks. Parks, as it turns out, account for less than 3% of all police calls for service, and that's including officer-initiated calls. But not all calls for service are necessarily relative in parks. You can't, for example, burglarize a park or typically shoplift from a park. So instead, we thought about quality of life calls for things that are frustrating and annoying, but not, and that could happen anywhere. When we looked at those and narrowed it down, we still had less than 3% of quality of life calls occurring in parks. Beyond that, as we know, the justice system filter sort of narrows down. Not all calls for service result in a crime report, but of those that do, less than 1% of those reports filed occurred in parks. To put this in perspective, we have a little bit of a map here. The parks are in green, and this map includes hotspots of quality of life calls for service. Usually we do those in red, but in orange, but it's kind of hard to see on these screens, so we went with blue to red. So colored spots on this map here indicate that concentration of quality of life calls for service. So as you can see, there are some in parks, but most are not in parks. On top of that, the actual concentrations of these calls for service are telling. So in downtown, where you might be able to see a red or blue dot there, that area, just that little downtown area, has over 900 quality of life calls for service from January to July this year. In contrast, Hudson, Daly, and Tempe Beach parks each had about 200 calls apiece.
So when you look at that information, it's really just providing that context when we look at crime and what issues we're dealing with throughout the city. At the same time, we have some problems in our parks, and we have some other problems we don't know when we've talked to people. Is everything being reported? But bottom line is there's issues there where people have concerns of safety, at least in some of our parks, and that's a concern. And I put that through that filter of my own family. My kids are not little anymore, but I remember taking kids to the park, my wife taking kids to the park, and kids going to the park by themselves, and you want to have that feeling that when you do that, that's okay, more likely than not. And so regardless of what the data shows, this is a concern, and that is important to us as a police department. So let's look at strategies. There's a number of strategies and initiatives that we have and are in the process of taking. And I don't have the time, to be frank, to go through all of these. So what we're focusing on here are the specific strategies that we're looking at as collaboration to address a lot of these, the feeling of safety in parks. So first, there's 3 main areas we're looking at collaboration. First is public works and community services, and this has been in the works for some time being about 3 months now. And what this really looks at, if you break it down, and this is going to be a big chunk to take a chew on, but you look at this adds presence, enforcement, it looks at design, maintenance, and activation in our parks. And so when we do that, we're working as a team to come up with really that code of conduct for our parks. So what does that mean? Basically those behaviors that really we all just expect about when we go to the park. Doesn't matter who's using the park, but those expectations that we have. Some of those are covered in ordinance, either civil or criminal violations, but some of those are things that are really more policy-driven type things. Like, for example, some of the frustration that's been expressed is, how come there's some people that will sit at the Ramada and occupy it all day long and nobody else can use it? It's a frustration thing, not necessarily a crime. But how do we incorporate that into a code of conduct and then take those items, and roll that into a job description, if you will, for private security, similar to what we've done learning from success at Escalante with G4S, or just recently over at JC Park at the Westside Multi-Generational Center, or even right here at this complex at the library. So how do we take that? We give them those orders so they can kind of go and be present, be seen far more, because I can't put a cop at every single park 24/7. I'd love to do that. We can't. But this provides that greater presence. And so the community can see that and engage with that. And if there are behavior issues, they can address it as appropriate. And then if it rises to the level of the police involvement, we can do that. They tie directly into our radio system. And then we continue to do on the back end a lot of things that we have been doing with this extra reinforcement, if you will. And then we're working together as a team to evaluate the lighting, the design, the redesign, and maintenance schedules of the parks. How often do our teams get out there to clean? We work really well together when we see certain things in parks, of calling out Public Works and saying, hey, we're seeing this, can you come out and clean this up or take care, we'll help you. That happens all the time. But some of the things in the design, we do a lot to invest into our parks, either in CIPs or we do those grants for neighborhoods to beautify their areas. A lot of that money will oftentimes go into parks, and we design really cool spaces, but we need to be really smart about how we're doing that. Are we creating spaces that environmental design-wise encourages the behavior we're looking for, or does it create hiding places, or does it create other challenges, unintended consequences that we need to be aware of? And all of that coming together to look at park activation. And park activation, overly simplified, really is just bringing life, natural life and activity to that space, that community space in the parks. And that looks different from park to park. Some places you turn the lights on like they did at Escalante, and all of a sudden the kids showed up at night and started playing soccer. It's awesome. Sometimes there's a dog park. Sometimes I met with Majda yesterday, and sometimes it's Arts in the Park, and we bring things like, it was like Dancing with the Dogs or something like that. Does nothing for me, zero. But people get into that. My sister-in-law would totally dig that, right? But it just brings us together into that space. And every park looks different, and every community looks different at what that activation, but doing something to bring that park to life and adding that extra layer for that place. And that next area is working with city leadership and researching park curfew as a criminal offense. A number of years ago, we went to civil. That was a different time and a different place and a reason for that. Fast forward to where we are now, making that a criminal offense gives us, as a police department, more options as far as enforcement when needed. It doesn't mean that when someone's in a park after hours, they automatically goes to jail. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means if we're warning someone, we're trying to deal with a problem, and over a period of time, this certain person or that group, for whatever reason, is not getting it, it gives us an opportunity to take enforcement action as opposed to just giving a piece of paper to go on their way. So we're in the process of researching that with leadership and legal right now. And lastly, the collaboration with the city homeless operations team. And so back in June of 2017, somewhere about in there, the homeless operations team, consisting of the police department, community services, a bunch of people in the city, met with a council here and talked about how we're going to look at this homeless, a plan to address primarily encampments at that time. And a part of that was year 3 of that, which is going to this budget cycle, is adding 2 officers and a sergeant to complete that parks detail. And so this is that year for that. And so we continue to work with the budget part of that particular request, which addresses multiple council priorities, not just this one specifically. So some of the challenges is when we look at some of the issues and feelings of safety in the park, some of them are criminal in nature and some of them are poor behavior in nature, and some of them are completely separate of those two. And so as a police department, it's difficult. We have to be very cautious about how we go and address certain problems because we can't treat non-criminal issues like criminal issues. It puts us as a city and the police department in a bad spot. And so there's a filter that we're constantly having to put things through, which can create frustration for everybody, but that's a challenge. The evolving court decisions surrounding urban camping, and this leading up to the last couple days, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals handed down a decision regarding urban camping that's going to have a dramatic impact on cities in our area about urban camping and how we enforce it. And our legal folks are looking at that, right now, but that is a game changer. And so how we evolve with that and how we address behaviors like that, that's an issue. Just social issues and enforcement. When police are relied upon to solve some homeless issues, it often doesn't work out really well. We're not prepared to do that. We deal with the behavior, portion of that, and we deal with the enforcement part of that, but oftentimes, while doing the right thing to address the enforcement, it actually exasperates the social issue, with that long term. So that can create, challenges, which is why it is so important that we work collaboratively with not just law enforcement, but as we're doing with community services and public works and everybody bringing a seat to the table of how do we really chip away at this and work together as a team. And lastly, like everybody else, it's a limited resources, conversation. So how do we maximize the resources we have? I mentioned the 2 parks officers that we have currently. That originally by design was primarily for the desert parks. Well, in addition to some on-duty resources, we've had to deploy them amongst other places. And to be honest with you, we're losing ground in our desert parks. And it's just happening. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But limited resources is definitely a challenge. So we look at the strategies primarily. We talked about the collaboration and primarily looking at right now looking at the code of conduct and the private security component of that. Exploring curfew as far as making that criminal, and then completing that parks police squad that we talked about. So that's a lot in a little bit more than 10 minutes. And whatever ideas, thoughts, questions?
All right, thanks. Let's hear from the audience if you have any questions for our presenters.
Yes.
Got one in front. You have to wait. We need you on mic. We are recording.
Hi, how are you? So you mentioned something about the Ninth Circuit Court decision about urban camping. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what that decision was?
Just very briefly, because it's a lot more complex than we will probably have time to go into. But essentially, overly simplified, they look at, it's a case out of Boise, Idaho, which is actually a similar community to Tempe, if you've ever been up there. But essentially, they look at if you're enforcing urban camping, we call it urban camping related ordinances, and you don't have a place to actually take that person, that violates the 8th Amendment of cruel and unreasonable punishment. There's a bunch of nuances. There's about 40 pages, it's roughly a 40-page ruling, and so we're having to go through all of that and pick out all the nuances, but overly simplified, that's what it says.
Over here.
Ken?
Yes.
Thanks, guys, for all the great information. I just want to congratulate you on how you've taken up the strategic management and identified a performance measure that's really pertinent to what we do on a day-to-day basis. It would have been easy to say 1% of our calls for service are in parks, therefore we don't have a problem, let's allocate resources elsewhere. But when half the people in the city say, I don't feel safe going to my city park, we have an issue, and you've identified a difficult situation. So I appreciate it, and good luck on your efforts.
Questions? I'll jump in real quick. Mike, you alluded to this a little bit in terms of the police being the solution to some of the issues involving, let's say, homelessness in parks. But it's fair to say that the perception of safety and the actual numbers of safety aren't always the same, and that's kind of what Ken said. So what do you see in terms of achieving the strategy of moving the needle with respect to public perception as being the sort of the keys to not so much from an enforcement issue, but from just how do we change people's minds about safety? Does it require removal of certain uses, substitution of other uses? We talked about activations.
Yeah, the other piece to this, and just in the interest of time, I didn't include, but that's that a part of it is that there's a there's a communication strategy that comes with that. And so, and along the way, so part of it is, like, for example, I know with Arts, only just because I had the conversation yesterday with Arts in the Park, you know, there's a community input piece to that of what that should look like ideally for that specific community. So there's that on the front end. But then as we start to employ, like, for example, if we're successful in deploying private security, depending on, quite frankly, funding as far as how much we can actually deploy it. But if we can do that and then communicate that with our communities so that they first of all know to be looking for it and they can see it. And so there's just that piece that they're seeing. And then we're also looking at, I want Brooks to weigh in on kind of the technology is not the right word, but as far as the tracking community input, there's some avenues like that we're looking at to do that.
Sure. So we're looking into a company called Elucid that tracks community sentiment about police departments. They're operating in several major cities nationwide. The benefit of using them is that they collect data monthly rather than yearly, so that we can determine on a much more regular basis whether or not any strategies we're employing are effective.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Got one back here, Paul.
In addition to what Mike's talking about and Brooks is talking about, there's recently created a task force within the city, Homeless Solutions Task Force, which includes all the partners that Mike talked about, which is community services, the courts, prosecutors, human services, PD, Tempe Fire Medical Rescue. So all the individuals that have at some point in time are interacting with individuals who are homeless and identifying commonalities in regards to issues that we're facing. One of those is parks, and one of those is the perception of safety in parks. So in addition to what Mike's talking about, that group is meeting on a monthly basis. That is one of the higher priorities in regards to including Nikki with the community relations component and the education of our community of what is and what isn't. But there's many pieces moving on that topic.
Yeah, I could just real quick touch on the private security component too. Just because as people see this over the next month or whatever it is. But right now we're looking at focusing on the 4 main parks that we look at. We know that there's concerns anecdotally, and also the data would suggest. So there's 4 main parks that we're looking at right now to test over the next 6 months or so. And then from there we can look to expand. I just don't want people to look at it and think, why are they in my park? They may not be there. Maybe some other measures we're putting in place for those locations.
Great. All right, thank you so much. Well done, thank you. Okay, staying on that safety theme, we will bring up the next presenting group on performance measure 1.11, safety in city facilities. Come on up.
Yeah, I'll behave today. Oh, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for continuing and staying with us for feelings of safety in city facilities, specifically the ones managed by community services. I am joined here today by my very esteemed colleagues, Carlos from the library, Alec with recreation, and I am Sally, and I am with Tempe Center for the Arts. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about today, staying with that safety with the council. We're going to start with the council priority measure, talking about the city's commitment to security and safety in our facilities here. So this performance measure is 1.11, and basically what, as Commander Horn just spoke to about a minute ago, is that this is the city's commitment to reaching that level of very satisfied or satisfied within our facilities that that community services manages. And this is based on national benchmark levels that have been determined. And so we're striving to reach those top 10%, that top 10%. So why does this measure matter? There's 4 key reasons that this is really important to us. First of all, is just that general feeling of safety in our public spaces. When people walk into, whether it's a library, a rec center, the arts center, or anywhere else, We want them to walk into an area that's well lit, that is clean, where there's a friendly smile greeting them when they walk in the door so that they feel comfortable and they're happy and they know this is someplace that they can come to over and over again and really just know that they can spend some time there and hang out with all of us, right? Then, of course, we want to look at how our guests and our employees feel. Do they feel safe in these spaces as well? This is important because those are the voices that are going out into the community, telling everyone about the city of Tempe, about, hey, I went to the library the other day, and, they have amazing computers. They all work. I was at the Multi-Gen Center the other day in the workout room, and every piece of equipment was working. I was at the Art Center, and, the lobby was immaculate. It looked fantastic. Versus if they walk into a space and they're like, oh, gosh, I couldn't find a single machine, and the rowing machine was broken, et cetera, et cetera. They don't necessarily want to go there, and then we start to get that reputation of, well, the equipment's broken, so it must not be a safe place to go and spend time. And so that voice goes out to the community, and we all know what happens when we start getting a bad reputation. We have to work 60 times harder to regain that. The other part of that, and this is for all the accountants and risk folk in the room, the other part with when people feel safe is that there are also fewer claims and litigation. So we're saving money. We want to save money, right? And then we move on to quality of life. The city is very committed to promoting a sense of wellness and well-being to our residents. And so when we give them good, safe places to take their children, to study, etc., they feel that they are getting more bang. Our residents feel like they're getting more bang for their buck, quite frankly. And then finally, there's the old saying that perception is reality. So again, it goes back to how do you feel when you walk into a space? Do you know that that the people that are there are people that you're going to be comfortable with, even if you don't know them? Do you feel safe and comfortable in that space? So staying on the idea of community perception, one of the things that community services is very interested in doing is finding ways to help our community engage with our spaces. And so what we're looking at, we team up and we work quite a bit with Public Works, and we find those areas where maybe there's graffiti or other things that can be considered blight, for lack of a better term. And we are looking for ways to make the spaces more engaging by working with local artists and just brightening areas up. So you see lots of murals going around town. I mean, come on, we even paint our utility boxes and make them fun, right? And so you see people being more active and actually engaging with these things that you're and wanting to go, hey, did you see this down on Mill Avenue? This is the greatest thing ever. We got to go hang out. We got to check this out. And they go there because, number one, it's fun, but number two, because we have brightened it up and more people are going there, they feel safe about going there to those areas. And even it's to the point that some of the engagement we're creating is being used as backdrops in people's photographs and things like that. Because again, why? They're going there because it's a place that they feel comfortable. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carlos, and he's going to talk to us about the data.
Thank you, Sally. The goal of 90% for a feeling of safety in Tempe was set after the resident survey, and we can see from the numbers here that we still have a little ways to go to reach that. However, Tempe rates higher than cities of a similar size for this rating. When we take a closer look at the library and facilities, recreation facilities, we see that the numbers are a little higher and they're closer to our goal of 90%. But we also see that at night the numbers will drop and they move closer to the overall level for the city.
Yeah, there you go.
Comparison to national rates. According to the data from the OECD Better Life Index, the city of Tempe matches the national rate for feelings of personal security alone at night. The previous slide also showed numbers that match up with this in the evening, and that we're close to this number in the facilities. Police calls for service. Going back to 2015, we see most of the facilities listed experienced a drop in calls for service in 2016. Following in 2017, the numbers for calls of service rose at each facility. One note, the increase at the West Side Center is due to full-time security being implemented. And for security incident reports, the number of incidents recorded here is much higher than police calls for service. These numbers are collected by city contracted security provided by G4S. On-site security have far more contacts with patrons and the community than PD. The majority of these contacts do not reach the level for calls of service to police. Since 2016, the number of incident reports has increased at the library, and the number of trespasses from these contacts has gone up as well. At the same time, we can see that the Escalante Center has experienced a steady decrease in the number of incident reports and trespasses. This is due to the increase in hours by on-site security. So it's full-time there now. And next, I'm going to hand it off to Alex, who will talk about increasing strategy.
So as Carlos just mentioned, I'm going to discuss with you community services strategies for improving the feeling of safety in city facilities, as well as some recent enhancements and future opportunities. So using compiled data as well as employee feedback and observations, we developed 3 strategies to improve the feelings of safety in city facilities, the first being to leverage technology. So we need to continue to use current technology to improve patron experiences at our facilities, as well as continually evaluate future technologies such as advances made in security camera technology. The second strategy is to evaluate staffing levels such as frontline staff that interact with the public on a daily basis, that engage the public on a daily basis, as well as continue evaluate staff training and education, as well as the potential to increase or expand security services provided at facilities. The third strategy is to evaluate building configuration and design through a design or redesign process that can analyze topics such as sight lines, functionality of facilities, facility maintenance, appearance, lighting, so on and so forth. So over the last several years, community services has made some enhancements in order to move the needle on this measure. Recently, in the last year or two, code of conduct at both the library and the multi-generational centers was updated, including an update to the computer use policy. The update to the computer use policy created a better environment for all facility users, as well as help build trust and improve the perception. Several years ago, the library campus, community services campus, implemented private security at that facility or at that site. Shortly thereafter, Escalante Multi-Gen Center followed with security, and then most recently, in July of this year, security was implemented at Westside Multi-Gen Center, and then later this year, Tempe Center for the Arts will have a security presence on that site. As Carlos mentioned, since the implementation of security, specifically at Escalante, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of police calls for service, the number of incident reports from G4S, a private security contractor, as well as, I guess more importantly, we've seen a reduction from 2016 to 2017, almost half of the number of trespasses, from 44 in 2016 to 22 trespasses in 2017. We've also made a concerted effort to engage the public and to activate spaces at parks, which are next to facilities, or neighborhood parks, which are next to some of our facilities. The activation efforts have included holding community events or family-friendly community events, additional sports and activities, as well as sometimes just simply turning on the field lights and allowing community members to come out and utilize the space, as Commander Horn mentioned, has recently happened at Escalante. Carlos discussed the fact that Tempe residents feel approximately 20% less safe at night compared to the day when they're visiting our facilities. So as part of a renovation at Escalante, field lighting was enhanced or improved or installed, I guess I should say, as well as a fitness path, walking, jogging fitness path was installed with several fitness stations around the path. Since that time, the level of activation, the level of involvement and engagement, both through city programming as well as just community members coming out to take advantage of the field and the path, has been tremendous. It's made a huge difference, positive impact in that area, engaging folks to come out and activate that space. It's been more accessible, it's been inviting, and those have all changed the perception of the area. As recent as this summer at JC Park, which is adjacent to Westside Multi-Gen Center, we also turn on the lights on the field when it's not being reserved or when it's not held for private reservations. Just turning on the lights has engaged the community to come out and activate that space, to engage, play soccer, as Commander Horn had said, at that location. Even though it's a softball field, they still utilize that field and grass to participate in activities. The lighting being on has made an impact not only in the field, but also to provide a safer environment at the splash pad as well as on the playground, so folks can come out and stay and play longer and feel safe. Providing that safe environment has helped build a stronger community connection with those folks, with the residents, and having a strong community connection lends itself really well to improving feeling safe. While we're on the right track and we've made some changes and improvements, we believe as community services as a department, we believe 3 out of 10 people not feeling safe and 4 out of 10 people not feeling safe at night when they visit city facilities is unacceptable. So we have some work to do. We have areas that we need to improve upon. Some of the areas that we need to improve upon are tied to the strategies that I mentioned earlier. We need to continue to focus on or look at improving lighting both in and outside of facilities, in and around facilities, whether that's in a park, the exterior walk up to a facility. There's about a 20% difference in the number of feeling safe between daytime and night among Tempe residents. So having lighting or ample lighting can go a long way. We need to continually evaluate our technology, as I mentioned earlier, such as in security cameras. There are several facilities within community services that are still using what I would consider archaic technology. We're using analog cameras. I've been told by some companies that come in to potentially repair them that if they can't repair them, at sometimes they can't replace them as well, because the way the system works is they can't put a digital camera on our system because it's too old. We need to continue to do a better job at directing patrons to the correct resources, such as through Care 7 or through the homeless coordinator or other human services. We need to continue to train employees, specifically frontline employees, to be able to better address the needs of customers, to be able to better recognize when they have issues or they need resources, and to be able to point them in the right direction. As well as we need to be able to, we hope to be able to make changes in community services with staffing to be able to provide better programming, more programming in order to activate spaces, to engage the community, to create a better perception, as well as create that strong community connection. Updating parks and facilities through remodeling or renovation is another area that we can improve, not only through perception, but also engagement. As Sally mentioned, a person's perception is oftentimes their reality, which, whether we believe it or not, that's their reality, that's their perception, so that's going to change the way they feel and their emotions. In addition to activating spaces through programming, we need to ensure that our facilities are suitable for those programs. And we realize that whatever all these things community services doesn't happen in a vacuum. The things we do are really tied to other departments. Every department, every office in the city touches this measure some way, somehow. We believe we need continued collaboration, just at an accelerated pace. So as we continue to move towards our goal, to reach our goal, a simple question to you is, how might we accelerate our performance? And with that, I'll open up to if someone has an answer to the question, or if you just have questions, if you have questions for us, we'll try to take them the best we can.
All right. A lot of good information there. Any questions from the audience?
Perfect.
Awesome, thank you.
We're not done just yet. We let people. They're still letting it all sink in, So got to give them a chance to.
Specific questions. A lot of it tied to. I mean, really, Commander Horn kind of stole some of our thunder. He mentioned a lot of things that we talked about. He specifically called out Escalante and the programming, activating that space, turning on lights, just getting people engaged from the community. So it's really a lot of what he talked about is similar to what we had. We just obviously we don't have that specific police data as far as to show that the number of crimes in parks or the number of crimes at facilities compared to other things.
I would argue that you guys have had that success, a lot of things that you've done, and so you've been ahead of the curve and have provided us an example that we can build off of.
Thanks, Commander.
Gracious. I have, actually, Andrew, go ahead.
First off, thank you so much for the presentation information. In looking at the presentation, it looks that the library seems to be a significant issue when we're dealing with the feeling of safety and security. And when you talked about activation plans with the parks and with everything else, turning the lights on the field, is there a plan in place for the configuration of lighting around the library area? And I would assume in between the library and then the historical museum, or if there's certain parts of that, because you can't activate the park per se, and that seems to be a very large area that has the issue and continues to rise up. Is there a plan for that specific location?
You guys did a great job, by the way. Thank you. So to answer your question, we have it's basically a 15-acre campus that community services sits on with the library and the other buildings. So the lights are on timers, obviously. We also are we have neighborhoods that are adjacent to those as well. So to have lighting on 24/7 would be a little detrimental to the quality of life to our neighbors. But we do work with facilities to make sure that everything's on a timer. We have increased security that comes in before hours and stays late until the after hours. And we've had great success with the increased patrols from PD as well. That said, we still have a lot of work to do to kind of get where we need to be. So I know it doesn't directly address your question, but that's what we're working on.
To add to that, just with the numbers at the library, you saw they trend in pretty much every category. They trend north, we'll call it. Some of that's, I guess, is due to several factors. If you go back to 2015, the number of hours that the private security company was on site was, we'll call it, limited. And over time, those hours as well as bodies has increased. So the number of reporting opportunities has increased, so those numbers are naturally going to go up. In addition to that, there was an orbit route added, so that potentially brings in extra traffic. There was a library in another neighboring city that was closed down for a year, which is actually the tail end of that graph, that we had an influx of people, as well as in that time we added another department to that campus, so that brings in other people to that campus as well.
Additionally, Public Works, we're working with Public Works and some other folks on a library landscape plan, and that will, I think it's a four-phase plan all around the campus, and that will enhance a lot of different areas. And we're also trying to get cameras, and as soon as Ken releases the money, we'll go.
All right. Any other questions? I guess I had an observation/question. I was interested in, you focused on the library, you talked quite a bit about Escalante. The things, the priorities and the acceleration you're talking about, how translatable is that to the extent that you can answer to this building or other multi-gen centers or any of the multiple facilities the city has all over the place, some of which are very public, some of which are less so? Are these scalable and modifiable, in your opinion, to all these other facilities that we have that can also have safety issues from time to time?
I would say yes. Actually, and this facility is a great example of the implementation of G4S, and I think in some ways served as a model for the library and for Escalante, and soon to be for the Art Center as well. And I think any of the strategies that we looked at, finding ways to just kind of activate spaces. You know, some of us were talking beforehand about this little park out here on 6th Street, and you know, there's always potential to do something. One of the greatest activations that really kind of serves not just as a model for other parts of the city, but really for the entire state, is the Mill Avenue Arts Festival, when you think about it. And just, you know, how many thousands of people come down here and feel very comfortable and are happy and safe in that space. It's because we're taking those measures. We're working together. We're working with Public Works, with the police department. We have security around. So I think anything can be scaled. Any of the ideas that we presented today can be scaled up or down to ensure that our residents and our visitors want to be here, and that we can find ways to increase their level of comfort both day and night within the city.
Good. All right, anything else for this presenting group? Excellent job. Thank you so much.
Send us your ideas and suggestions to Tempe Accelerates at tempe.gov and visit us at tempe.gov/Tempe Accelerates.